Good. So if we may, it's already 5 minutes out. So we have enough participants already, attendees already. I think we can start off, and those who will join us will find us in the middle, but we can begin off with at least with the introductions already. Welcome to Ajua's Stay Alive webinars, series of webinars. Every week, basically, we do a webinar that is focused on our businesses and working with business towards staying alive during this COVID-19 pandemic. And today we've got with us Michael Cusumano. I will let somebody else introduce him much better than I can because he's known him for ages. But today's topic is about the business of platforms, strategy in the age of digital competition, innovation and power. And this could be more relevant right now where the world is changing demographically, accelerated especially by COVID-19 pandemic, and new business and new social infrastructure is being created as we speak and being accelerated as we speak. And most of these are being underpinned on the power of digital transformation, accelerated literally on steroids. So without much further ado, let me introduce Canfield, who's the CEO of Ajua, to introduce himself first, and then also introduce Michael, and then Michael can kick off and take us towards today. Now, what I would like us to do is make sure that you put your questions already in the question and answer box. We do try at the end to try and answer as much as possible, so the earlier you put your question, the better for you. And some of them we could consolidate with other questions as well, but do not wait until the end. Just put in your questions in the Q&A already, and we'll get to answer them and get Michael to answer them as much as possible towards the end. Thank you. Over to you, Kenfield.
Thanks, Gilbert. Hi, everyone. This name is Kenfield Griffith. I'm the CEO of Ajua. And as Gilbert mentioned, we are really trying to get everyone around the same topic of how do we thrive and stay alive through this period. And how we do this is actually setting up these webinars every week to talk about an issue that we should be thinking about and how do we build businesses that are very, very resilient to times like this. So today, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Michael Cusumano. Professor Cusumano has been at MIT for over 30 years, and his background, obviously, he's the godfather, I should say, of platforms, and really having that mindset of what a platform means in business. And you've heard this topic before with different business models such as Facebook, such as Intel, such as and Uber, and what really defines a platform. And more than now, it's so critical for us to discuss it because of where we are moving and how everything is moving digitally. So let me give you a bit of background of Professor Michael. He is a distinguished professor at MIT, and he holds positions on boards from US boards all the way to boards in Japan. He's also been a visiting professor in Japan, also, Alcatel, Fujitsu, GE, Motorola, NASA, Nokia, NTT Data, and the list goes on and on. And the business of platform is really thinking about the business model. And how do you actually look at business models in the digital age, knowing that you have a consumer or a demand side and a supply side. However, I'll leave it there and introduce Professor Michael Cusumano to begin and get us riled up on how we can stay alive as businesses through this very difficult time. So off to you, Professor Cusumano.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kenfield. And again, let me thank you for inviting me to give this seminar. And I will just give you some highlights of my recent book with David Yoffie and my former student, Annabelle Gawer. And hopefully you can dig more deeply into the topics in the book itself. So let me try to move on. All right, so just quickly, I'll give you an overview of what we talk about in the book and what I'll do today. So I'm going to talk about some basic concepts of platform thinking, a framework we use to evaluate and even predict the outcomes of markets that we now call platform markets, the winner take all or most framework. I'll give you a little taste of the strategy and business model frameworks that we also use. And at the end, if we have a few minutes, I'll tell you about some of the platforms we're looking at that will impact the future. We also talk about how old dog or old economy companies can compete with platforms, common mistakes entrepreneurs make, And also platforms as double-edged swords. We won't have time to talk about that today, but platforms have good and bad features. They can become very powerful. They can misuse user data. They can be misused by outside parties, like we saw with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. So it's a big topic, and I'll really give you more of the business and entrepreneurial view of platforms. One of the first points to make is that platforms are everywhere. And particularly in these days of the coronavirus, when we're doing everything online, we realize how dependent we are on platforms, the point that Kenfield made. So in the early days, of course, I studied personal computers, and before that, mainframes and video recorders through concepts that today we would call network effects and platforms. So I've actually been studying platforms for about 30 years. And we've seen just an explosion of platform thinking and almost all different technologies and technology-driven services, particularly over the web. Even power systems, whether you have gasoline engines or hybrid systems, electric vehicles, or hydrogen fuel cells. How those technologies diffuse through an economy are really governed by the same kinds of forces, let's call them network effects, that you would see in personal computers or smartphones or web services or Internet of Things. The other point about this is that platforms work on top of or alongside other platforms. So really we live in a world of layered platforms. And in many cases, the Internet or Internet of Things is the bottom layer. And then we have all these applications, which often are platforms in and of themselves, like for payment systems. Okay, and they're all sort of layered and working together. Now I'm going to give a little bit of an academic overview, and then I'll get into more of the entrepreneurial overviews. If we go back and trace the use of the term platform, it really became common, and I remember writing a book on automobile industry platforms in the 1990s. And it was quite popular in the operations management literature. So we've often talked about company platforms and supply chain platforms. And these are organized hierarchically, usually with an original equipment manufacturer or an OEM at the top, such as an automaker, and governing the innovation process essentially through contracts. They have their major partners, and then tier 1 suppliers, and they have their suppliers, tier 2, tier 3, and it's very hierarchically organized. Companies like in the auto industry might have several hundred suppliers. And I'm going to make some distinctions, but the word platform gradually was expanded from that kind of company-controlled set of, let's say, building blocks and systems that suppliers could use to build components to a different environment. And on the right-hand side here, I'm showing a picture of kind of a platform network, which is this nebulous global set of relationships between not really suppliers. We don't even count those as part of what we would say an ecosystem here. They're kind of controlled by the platform company, but there's partners and complementers. These are companies that are voluntarily, without contracts, although they might sign a licensing agreement, making products and services that add value to that platform in some way or depend on that platform. And then, of course, we have customers. So this is a nebulous relationship extending to thousands and millions of firms and even billions of users. And it's a different kind of environment. And we've been calling this an ecosystem, I don't know, maybe for about 20 years. But it's a new way of thinking, but gradually it's kind of taken over the way a lot of technologies and markets are organized. Okay, there's a little bit of a delay in the animation here, but let me give you the formal definition we use. So we try to make a distinction between a company-controlled platform and an industry platform. So the industry platform is this foundation that many firms can use to create or sell what we'll call complementary products and services. And the more of these complements we have, the more valuable the platform becomes. And that is a network effect. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. The word network effect is one of the most misunderstood terms in management, I think, and also economics. The other point here is that these various innovations or transactions would not occur, or at least not occur so easily without the platform. Now we start out, actually I start out in the book writing about the decision that Bill Gates made in 1980 to control his ability to license the DOS operating system to other companies. IBM had come to him asking him to build essentially a component, the operating system for the IBM PC that they were designing. But Gates was immediately thinking that this could be the basis for many companies to build compatible personal computers as well as software applications. So he kept control of it. And that's an example of product thinking versus platform thinking. And actually, Microsoft and IBM were the first companies in the software world to use the term platform. The first time I saw it was, I think it was 1988 or 1989, referring to the new operating system that they were building. This was OS2, which actually never got shipped. But let me show you this next graph. So the word platform has been around in many industries, but we saw a distinction when some foundation technologies became the basis for many companies to build their own products and services that had the use of that platform in common. So that was the first use of the term platform. Now, going into the later 1990s, once the internet came about, other people began using the term platform to refer to other types of businesses. And Amazon was one, for example, with first an online store, then Amazon Marketplace, which was launched roughly in 1999, 2000. And since then, we've seen many different types of platforms. And the list I had before of all the different areas gives you some idea. You can start creating categories like social networks and payment systems and marketplaces and operating systems, or publishing platforms, video streaming platforms, and the list goes on and on. And what my co-authors and I did when we started writing this book in 2015, which, by the way, we've attempted to summarize about 25 to 30 years of work that myself and David Yoffie and also Annabelle Gawer have done. We decided that, well, in fact, all platforms really can be divided into two types. And the first type are what we'll call innovation platforms. And these are the ones that I originally wrote about in the book 1995, Microsoft Secrets, Windows and DOS as a platform for third-party innovations. Annabelle and I published a book in 2002 called Platform Leadership. And that was also about Intel and Microsoft and Cisco and NTT Docomo in Japan. And these were primarily using some foundation technology to encourage third-party firms to develop their own products and services which complemented the platform. So today we see a range of these innovation platforms. We don't see millions of them because these innovation platforms are kind of the center of these huge networks of thousands and even millions of firms and billions of users. So of course, Microsoft DOS and Windows were among the first for the mass market. You could also put the IBM mainframe in there before that. But more recently, you have Android from Google and Force.com from Salesforce, Facebook for developers, WeChat APIs, even Amazon Web Services, which has lots of APIs and tools and reusable frameworks, even a marketplace for apps for people to build applications in the Amazon Web Services environment. So these are innovation platforms. So on the other side, the left side, are a newer type of platform that really came about with the internet. And here, again, we have marketplaces, online stores that are really trying to bring together buyers and sellers, Pinterest, for example, Snapchat, Airbnb, Uber, and there are commonalities between the two. So what I want to do is explain what those commonalities are. And then in the middle, we have hybrid companies, companies that own or have combined both types of platforms. And these companies, by the way, tend to be the most popular companies. They're also the most valuable companies in the world. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Tencent, and Amazon in particular. But the left-hand side, we call transaction platforms. So whether they're just trying to bring together buyers and sellers or bringing people together to exchange information for a price of zero, they're still essentially doing transactions. Okay. Let me move on. All right. So we have some delay in the animation here. Okay. Well, the most valuable companies in the world, as I've said, are these transaction platforms. I have a backup here if we get stuck. Of course, these are now trillion-dollar companies. We've also seen that about 60 to 70% of unicorn companies are also platform businesses. And again, there's a mixture of innovation first and then adding a transaction, or transaction first and then adding an innovation platform. But most of these really powerful technology companies that we see are really hybrid platform companies. And platform ideas are incredibly popular amongst entrepreneurs. So we're going to be seeing many, many more of these going forward. Okay, so my system is kind of freezing here. All right, let me just go over what are in common between these two types of platforms. It's still freezing again here. Oh. All right, so we think there are three things in common, and this is why we use the term platform for them. On the first point, all of these platforms, whether they're innovation or transaction, they're bringing together two or more market sides, whether they're users and innovators, producers of apps, or buyers and sellers, or advertisers and users. They're two different market sides. Second, when these market sides come together, or one attracts the other, and benefit accrues to the participants in the platform, that is a network effect. And that network effect can be direct, or what we call same side, like between users and users, like using a telephone or using Facebook amongst your other registered user friends. That's all among one type of user. And then you have indirect or cross side. That would be buyers and sellers, or payers and receivers of payments, or innovators and users. And then third, to get those network effects going, platforms have to solve what we call a chicken or egg problem. They've got to get started. And the result is a very complex business model and market dynamics, very much like playing three-dimensional chess. So a company in this market is not simply selling a product or service. They're actually dealing with multiple market sides at the same time. Okay, so it's very complicated, and it is different from traditional businesses. Okay. Slides are not working so well here. So, you know what? I am going to try to shift to a PDF. Okay. Now
yeah, times that is easier, Michael.
Yeah, let me get back online.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And start to share.
In the meanwhile, just a reminder to everyone, please do put your questions in the Q&A in advance, so that we can be able to answer as much as possible. So it will try and do it on a fast-in question basis. So the earlier you put it in, the better. So don't wait until the end. So do try and put them in at the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, so here we are. So Now here's some other data that we have. Now, when we started the book in 2015, one of the things we realized was that no one had actually studied the performance of these companies over time. We knew they were very powerful, very wealthy, but there was no real historical data. So we started with a list in 2015. We took the Forbes Global 2000 list and went through it. By the way, to get onto that list, you need to be a public company. You need to have billions of dollars in sales. So this is already a very select list of successful companies. We went through that and we chose modern digital platforms that appeared with the personal computer, internet services, and smartphones or mobile devices. And those were the kinds of platforms we were looking for. And we wanted to compare them to conventional non-platform firms in the same industry, in the same set of industries. Now, going through that 2000 list, we only came up with 43 companies that met that criteria. Also, we wanted to see, we set up a threshold. We wanted to see at least 20% of their revenues coming from a business driven by network effects across more than one market side. So we excluded some traditional companies like telecommunications or telephone companies. You could argue that they were the first platforms. We also excluded credit card companies. They're also multi-sided market companies, but they appeared really before the personal computer. So they're older platform businesses. So one of the striking things, and this confirmed our interest in platforms, the platform companies and the non-platforms in the same categories had roughly the same revenues, about $4.5 billion per year. But the platform companies achieved those revenues with half the number of employees. They had twice the sales growth rates. They had almost twice the operating profits and about 3 times the market value. So in many cases, again, they're growing much faster, they're much more efficient, and you can understand why. For example, if you're just bringing together buyers and sellers rather than operating as a store where you have to take on inventory, warehouse it, and sell it, your cost should be much less. You're just charging a transaction fee versus having inventory carrying costs and all the real estate. Now, Amazon, as you know, does both. It is both an online store, that's where it started, and it's also a marketplace platform. It also has web services. Or if you're a company like Google or Microsoft or Apple, you need millions of apps to make your smartphones or personal computers valuable. If you had to hire all of the engineers, it would be enormously expensive. But if you just open up the interfaces to your platforms and let the market produce those applications, it's a tremendous cost on savings. So it's not surprising that these companies, when they reach this level of success, do so efficiently and can grow so fast. Now, again, only 43 of the public companies out of 2,000 met our criteria for modern digital platforms, so they're kind of rare. You can't have too many of these. Everyone cannot be a platform. Everyone can be a complementer, but you're going to have a limit on the number of platforms you see, particularly innovation platforms. We see entrepreneurs creating transaction platforms in just about every market, but the number of successful innovation platforms tends to become smaller. We also identified about 209 failures among competitors of these 43 companies. So that's about a 17% success rate, which is not bad, but it's a little bit less success than we would see of MIT and Harvard graduates on average. Generally about 1 out of every 3 of companies from our alumni succeed. Now, what's the definition of success is another area. But the other problem too is that a lot of these companies succeed because they have a very strong product or service. It's not necessarily the platform network effects, or it's some combination that's hard to separate. Apple is a great example. That is Apple successful because it's a platform, the iPhone, for example, or is it successful because it's a great product or one of the first products with a great design? It's really a combination of the two. I'll get back into that issue. So here's our argument in brief. So if you're in a product business like Apple designing an iPhone, which by the way, when the iPhone first came out, it was bundled with applications that Apple had either built itself or contracted for. It was not launched as a platform. It was launched as a product. Same thing with the Macintosh when it first came out in 1984. Apple bundled the applications and sold it. It had not built an ecosystem. It changed that policy for the iPhone, and that's why it became a platform. But the Mac, Apple was very slow to really open up, and it was very expensive, and only Apple made its devices, so they never really, the Macintosh never became a mass market platform. The iPhone did, but it still only has 20% of the market share globally. Google, which was a much more open platform, has about 80%. But if you're in the product business, essentially, and you think you can add significant value by opening up your product to third-party complementary innovations, again, without going through the hierarchy of a supply chain contract, then try an innovation platform. Now, if you're in a service business, you have to think about, is it more profitable to connect market sides and charge a transaction fee rather than to own assets or hire employees and then resell goods or deliver services directly? But if you think it's more profitable to do the transaction matching, then try a transaction platform. The other issue here is that once a market becomes platformized, then competition changes. Like the early smartphone devices were basically bundled products, just like the BlackBerry device. But once that became like a computer with open innovation, contributing applications, the market's platformized, and the product companies have to transition to being a platform. And in those cases, it's really the best or the most open or accessible platform that wins the market, not necessarily the best product. And this is why Apple survived and did so well in the smartphone market, because they were able to adjust the strategy and evolve to a platform strategy. Which gets us to the next topic, and that is to really analyze why some of these platforms do so much better than others and why they tend to kind of kick out competitors. So we've identified 4 factors over the years. My colleagues over at Harvard and also some MIT graduates, Tom Eisenman, Jeffrey Parker, Marcia Van Alstyne, did a lot of the original work on this about 14, 15 years ago. But the first factor is strong network effects. So you're not going to have a successful platform unless you generate these effects between the users or complementers or buyers and sellers or demand and supply side. And this is new in platform thinking. In traditional strategy, or we never really taught managers to think about platform network effects. So this is new. The second is what we call multi-homing, that it weakens the position of a platform in network effects if users or complementers can use more than one platform at the same time for the same purpose. And this is also a new concept. You know, the platform should become your home. And that's what platform companies want you to do. So for example, if I shop on 100 sites rather than Amazon mostly, that's going to weaken Amazon's position, its network effects, for example. But if they encourage me to join the Amazon Prime Club, for example, and I get free delivery and discounts on prices, that's actually an anti-multi-homing strategy. Amazon is doing something to encourage me to stay on Amazon. And with other kinds of innovation platforms, often apps are incompatible or data is not transferable, or you have a service contract that ties you into one vendor, or the price of the platform could be expensive, like a PC or a smartphone. These are all strategies that encourage mono-homing, okay? And so this is pretty critical. It's a little different from what we see in the conventional world where we talk about switching costs, but not multi-homing or mono-homing. And then third, if a market has too many ways of competing through differentiation or niche strategies, then obviously that's going to weaken the market position of the leaders, and that happens in conventional markets too. Or if there's low barriers to entry, you're going to have a lot of competitors. So what you want to do as a platform company, whether you're an innovation platform or a transaction platform, is you want to get users and complementers to choose your platform and stay there. Okay. Now, one of the problems of Uber, for example, is that it's very difficult to stop people from using Uber or Lyft or Grab or other sources. It's for the rides, or conventional taxi cabs or buses. So there's lots of multi-homing, which really weakens the position of companies in that market. Same thing with online shopping. So here's our basic framework. First, you need to think about whether you're trying to create an innovation platform or a transaction platform. But beyond that, you need to figure out first, step one, which market size are you trying to bring together? Second, how are you going to get that momentum started and solve that chicken or egg problem? Third, you need to figure out how you're going to make money, your business model. And then fourth, if you reach this far, you need to think about governance rules. Who can do what on the platform? How are you going to prevent fraud, or if it's a marketplace, unauthentic or products, for example, or misuse of information or bad applications. If you're an innovation platform, all that will harm your reputation and generate negative network effects. Just go back quickly on what a network effect is. A network effect is a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop where the user experiences increasing value as more people join or use the platform. So in the case of Amazon Marketplace, for example, the more sellers there are, the more value it is to buyers to get on the platform. You can buy anything. And the more buyers there are on that platform, the more sellers want to sell, right? So they come onto the platform. There's a pull on both sides. In an innovation platform, the more applications or innovations there are available, accessible through the platform, the more that draws in users, and the more users come on, the more value is for everyone in the platform. So you have that dynamic going on, but it's not always clear which is the most important market side, and that's a critical decision to get the network effects going. So in the case of Android, for example, as we've seen in innovation platforms, it's usually the applications that create value for users. So if you're going to create an innovation platform, you need to, of course, create the features and building blocks that enable people to write applications. Then you have to figure out how you're going to distribute those, and you need handset makers, service providers, et cetera. So there's multiple sides here, plus a technology partner for the underlying software, even before you can get users. So there's many players you need to line up. Many companies make the mistake. For example, Steve Jobs made the mistake when he launched the Macintosh in 1984, thinking that the combination of the product design was most important, and he really neglected recruiting applications companies. He paid a few, including Microsoft, to bundle applications with the Macs, but he never built up an application ecosystem. So the Mac fell to about 2% market share, and Windows took about 95%. When Google came in, it kind of piggybacked on the applications ecosystem that already existed for the iPhone. And then it spent a lot of time recruiting handset makers. It made the operating system free, created the Open Handset Alliance, and basically gave it away. Okay. Facebook, of course, it has a lot of pieces here, but user access to the platform is free. They're the most important side. Then that's monetized. That's monetized through advertisers.
Zuckerberg. I didn't want this because
someone needs to mute their microphone if we can do that. Applications added.
But anyway, okay.
Facebook. Just give me a second. Give me a second.
Okay. Huh?
What's going on?
You feel like some don't
Michael, give me a second. Let me try and mute the person.
So just slide in.
Okay. All right. So you can see Facebook is a hybrid, brought-in applications. There's about 10 million applications and websites and many other content available. Airbnb as well. You can ask what is the most important part of this platform? It's really listings. So the entrepreneurs, they first started by creating a list of people with properties to rent. Then they were able to attract users, right? They didn't start out getting users and then go looking for listings. And then they brought in B2B partners to provide services to the listers, insurance, cleaning, and professional photography. And then they brought in B2C partners to add various services to the users. And these services kind of replaced what a hotel would do. What Airbnb essentially did was kind of break apart the hotel service market into just the room and not the other services. But they used the platform to bring in these other partners to add more services. So they can compete with hotels and vacation vendors through those bundled services, all through the platform. Okay, and in the case of Uber, the critical element was to have drivers. You can't have riders without drivers. You can have drivers without riders, right? So the drivers have to be driving around on kind of a flywheel. And Airbnb has joined them to offer rooms, and other partners have come in. So Uber has also moved from being just a transaction platform to a more hybrid innovation plus transaction platform. The innovation bringing in all these different services. Okay, so let me just, in my final section, talk about the business model. So the problem with many new platforms is that they take a lot of money to start, and they lose money as they operate, and they depend on venture capital. And the reason is not too complicated when we look at it, but there's a lot of ways these platforms spend money and ultimately lose money. So one of the biggest problems is they have to pay large subsidies to at least two market sides. And Uber is a great example of that. And by subsidies, I mean, they're making payments to drivers because they need those drivers. They're making payments even if you're not driving. They pay them bonuses and more of a salary in addition to the commission on rides. And then they keep prices below the market price, which is the taxi price, and which is below their cost. So in many cases, a platform like Uber loses money with every transaction. Sometimes the network effects are weak, or they really don't exist very much. I'll talk about Uber and WeWork. WeWork is pretty popular for renting space, or multi-homing is not costly, so you have a lot of multi-homing. And so you have a weak platform or weak network effects. There's not a lot of incremental value. So for example, if Uber adds drivers in San Francisco, it doesn't help me if I'm in New York. Same thing with Airbnb. So there, the network effects are kind of local, and people multi-home all the time as they go to different markets. Scale and scope economies could be weak, lots of competition, new regulations. The early platforms kind of skirted traditional regulations, like Airbnb would say, you know, we're not a hotel, we're just a technology company, or Uber made the same arguments. So they tried to avoid paying minimum wages or paying taxes that hotels or taxi companies had to pay. But now the playing field is being evened out by a lot of the local governments. And there's also been kind of a negative mood towards platforms, a little drop in usage and ad prices. And then in some other cases, a platform really has to dominate all or most of a market before they have enough market power to raise prices or end subsidies. And you know, this does happen. Uber, for example, in the Boston market has doubled its prices in the last 4 years as they've gotten more and more market power. But there's still Lyft, there's other car services, there's still taxis, there's buses, there's the transit system. So there's still a lot of competition. The other problem that we've seen is what we'll call platform mania. And I like to summarize this by saying platformizing a bad business does not make it a good business. So, you know, ride sharing or grocery shopping, even though you can do the processing on a digital platform, it doesn't generate the same profits as selling digital goods, like selling search services that Google does, and then advertisements, which is how they monetize, or selling software or digital streaming, right? A lot of these services that the platforms sell are very physical in the real world and expensive. Even Amazon, when it delivers goods from its store, it actually has to pay for the inventory and delivery of those stores. On Amazon Marketplace, which is about 60% of Amazon's revenues, they're just doing a transaction and maybe charging separately for fulfillment. So the Amazon marketplace is much more profitable than the store. And Amazon Web Services is many, many times more profitable than both of those businesses, because they're just selling essentially storage and computer processing services from servers. And that's very, very scalable. And if the platform has to subsidize two market sides always to operate, it really hasn't solved the chicken or egg problem. And the bigger the platform gets, the more money it loses. It's not really solving a demand supply imbalance. It's artificially populating one or both sides. And this is the problem of Uber and many other ride-sharing services. It's also the problem of many other sharing economy platforms. And I say they're platforms only in a very loose sense, because in many of these cases, the company owns the assets and is basically just reselling access to them. There's no matching of owners and users, for example. The Chinese bike sharing platforms, it's a disastrous business model. They lose money on every transaction, and then the assets get used up and just thrown away. And these are companies differentiating themselves by either price or color. Color is a terrible way to differentiate yourself. SoftBank made all these investments in sharing economy businesses. Some of them are platforms like Uber, but they're actually weak platforms. But WeWork is not a platform. WeWork takes ownership of real estate and then re-rents it on short-term leases. So it's really a company platform. It's a one-sided platform. And in that case too, the bigger it gets, the more money it loses, because it has to price low and spend a lot of money on renovations to attract users. So critical difference here, the bike sharing businesses, they're not multi-sided platforms. They generate no network effects. They're just one-sided internal platforms. They're like a standalone product or service, and they sell their services at below cost. So where Uber and Airbnb are quite different, Uber's been losing about $3 billion a year. Now it's about $1 billion per quarter structurally because of payments it has to make to drivers. And it's been losing, at least before the IPO, about 12.5% drivers per month, which means every 9 months they have to replace 100% of their drivers. That costs them $650 each to advertise for each new driver and pay them a small bonus. And so that alone was costing them about $3 billion a year, and that hasn't really changed. Airbnb does not have those kinds of subsidies. It doesn't have to subsidize supplier demand. It charges both sides. So it should always be a better business model, but even Airbnb has been pressured to grow. It's being pressured by competition from hotels. And so it even has had a loss in the last quarter. But Airbnb is a much better platform business model. It should always make money just by charging the transaction fees if it can control its cost. Okay, maybe I'll just end with this one more slide, that business advice. You want to start with a good product or service, and remember, platformizing a bad business, whether it's food delivery or sharing economy, kinds of businesses like WeWork, it doesn't make it a good business. It doesn't make it a digital business. Think about how to enhance your product with an innovation platform, or replace an expensive operation with a transaction platform. Look for market failures where the platform can bring together demand and supply in a way that the market doesn't naturally. Figure out which side attracts another side, and you make that side free, essentially, for users or complementers. That's the most important. And then finally, you want to grow through network effects, one side pulling the other, not from below cost subsidies and below cost prices. That's a great way to lose money. Okay, so let me end my presentation here and open it up to some Q&A. And I think
thank you very much, Michael. Really great presentation, and a good way to end as well. You know, we all get told that if you just sell an item at a loss of $1 for one item, if you sell 100 items, you don't make money. You lose $100, right? But when it comes to platform, we kind of forget all of that. We think we can still make money. So it's interesting to see the Uber angle and how exactly they expect to get out of it. Because what you're saying, the bigger they grow, the more they lose continuously. So interesting on that. Now, the first question here is coming. Oh, well, from Anonymous, I guess. But do you think platforms have a specific competitive advantage over traditional platform business? I think here they do mean the digital platforms during phases of external shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, it depends on what the platform is doing. So, for example, if you're a digital platform for doing things like webinars or working from home, or like a sharing platform, or even online shopping or a marketplace, yes, it definitely has an advantage. So we've shifted a lot of activity to that way. But if your platform is doing something like room sharing or even ride sharing, which hasn't been working, then those platforms are still going to lose money. So it does depend on the business, and it's not the platform that gives you the advantage, it's the particular business. So food delivery has suddenly jumped up, right? And that does not have to be done with a platform.
Yeah. Yeah, and just keeping it on COVID-19 pandemic, right? You know, what they say, you know, black swan events, like what they say, right, do create opportunities as well for either new businesses to come up or new business models, but also for platforms to crop up. And then we can look back at the previous black swan events, and they've created a momentum for some new platforms that we're seeing today. And based on that, to Dori Davari's question, which is about, is this crisis a good time for a win-win strategy when it comes to creating new platforms, especially digital businesses?
Well, yeah, almost everything has become digital now. I see some of the questions on the chat too. By the way, my list of examples was not comprehensive. There are hundreds and hundreds of platforms, so we don't list them all. So anything that provides a digital service, bringing together two sides, or anything, even a one-sided platform, can be very valuable if it's digital. So YouTube, for example, we definitely consider that a platform. It's bringing together content creators with content consumers and also advertisers. It's at least a three-sided platform. It's doing super well. Netflix, we don't actually consider a platform. It's more like an online digital store. So it buys content or invests in content and then resells it. But Netflix is doing phenomenally well, and it's not really a traditional multi-sided platform. So in the age of coronavirus, almost anything digital is going to be superior to anything physical, right?
Yeah.
And that's
exactly. There is a win-win. From Ricardo, could you provide insights into how building site dynamics work on manufacturing platforms? Are there differences when compared to building dynamics on service platforms like retail platforms?
So manufacturing versus service. So
yeah,
there are different ways of thinking about this. But again, we break out innovation platforms where you're trying to encourage outside companies to build products or services that in some way enhance the value of what you're producing. And yes, managing that process it's managing partnerships and open innovation. For example, we just see that Qualtrics, which is a little company that builds little metrics and other applications, they're partnering with Zoom, for example, because Zoom is becoming a platform. And it doesn't have to be multi-sided. It's just a service that Zoom can deliver. But there's all sorts of applications that can help you do chats and polls and manage your graphics better. And so Zoom doesn't have those capabilities. So it opens up its APIs or its programming interfaces to third parties. So that's a different process from if you're just trying to attract buyers and sellers. So the transaction processes, and we go through these in quite a lot of detail. We go through the 4 different steps and how they differ for a transaction versus innovation platform. So they are different, but the idea of bringing multiple sides together, creating a network effect where everybody benefits with the more participation in the platform, that is different from a traditional product or service business.
Yeah, and you've just mentioned about network effects, and there's a question really regarding that. And I want to tie it into another one regarding what are the new platform businesses that can start to come up, especially on the health or the tech or education sector. On network effects, how do you measure it, right? You know, because yes, there's this loop function, right? It just goes on and on. But how do you measure it so that you can project where you think it could end a couple of quarters or a couple of years from today. And then, of course, looking at health or education, is that measurable from a network effect that you can say, okay, one, I can now start to focus on that based on this COVID-19 pandemic. Say, I could start off with this whole health and education investment from a digital perspective is going to really kick off.
Well, it's hard to measure network effects. I actually have a bunch of slides on that, but I didn't think we'd have time to go over them today, and we don't have time to go over them today. There is a formula that we do use. It's measuring the value of a network depending on how many nodes there are. So we call that Metcalfe's law. And so we do have ways of measuring network effects. You can also, using some econometrics, separate out what is a increasing utility due to scale versus just simply an economy of scale effect. Economies of scale and network effects are closely related, but the network effect is different because there's a positive feedback loop, and the positive value can be theoretical, not just actual. But so we know that if there's 2 million applications available on the iPhone and only 100 on the BlackBerry smartphone, the iPhone is probably going to be more valuable because you can do so many more things with it. And that differential grows depending on the disparity between applications and different sides. So you can make calculations and rough estimates. But generally, we think of there's a threshold effect beyond which network effects really don't kick in for these markets. So entrepreneurs have to think about how do you get big fast, or how do you get the right kind of quality complements to your platform to get things moving. You can have a lot of applications, but if they're things nobody uses, it doesn't matter. But there are ways of thinking systematically about this. So we've been working on this, and others have for 20 years or so. Again, it's a complicated discussion, but many people think they have network effects and they really don't. They have scale or lack of scale, but there is no real positive feedback loop between multiple sides going on.
Yeah, and there's this quote by this professor of physics, Albert Bartlett, who said, the greatest shortcomings of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function, right? And I think it's that exponential function of how network effects play out that is quite a mystery to a lot of us. So I guess that whole measurement part is coming in effect of people just trying to understand the exponential function of how the network effects work.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when I talk about network effects, we certainly explain that. So actually the coronavirus is a very good example of exponential network effects. And so the way, we explain this often, say with even Facebook, a friend comes in, a friend brings in friend of friends and friend of friend of friends and friends of friends of friends. And very quickly you get from 2 people to 2 billion people, right? Just in a few years. And because each person coming in is bringing in another network. And we have that impact in coronavirus. 10 people in one party, then they go out, they go to other parties where there's 100 people, and then those 100 people go to other events where there's 1,000 people, etc. And that's the way these platform businesses, in a positive way, try to build their networks. And that's why Facebook is so valuable. That's why Amazon Marketplace has become so valuable. By the way, Amazon did lose money for many years before it made money, but most of the money it was losing was investing in physical infrastructure and building out its network, which it didn't really have to do. And that a lot of those expenses were for the physical infrastructure of stores. And Amazon Store is not a platform in itself. It's really a one-sided company platform. They buy and they resell. But they were able to use that physical network to enhance Amazon Marketplace by selling fulfillment services. And then underlying everything was their network of computer centers and systems. And they began selling additional computing, processing, and storage capacity as Amazon Web Services. And that is actually the profit engine of Amazon. About 60% of Amazon's profits come from Amazon Web Services, and they only account for about 12% of their revenues. So that's a kind of a golden goose of profit that Amazon has relied on to expand its physical network as well as its digital network. So Uber, for example, does not have that golden goose generating profits. It's just generating losses the bigger it gets.
Yeah, I guess sometimes it's difficult to know which one will be that golden goose, right? 10 years ago, I don't know if Amazon had that that capability to know that, okay, it's going to be AWS that generates, a much higher profit margin, I guess.
No,
But,
I think they stumbled into AWS, but they could tell in the beginning that Amazon, a marketplace, would be more profitable than a store. Because they're just charging a transaction fee, but you have to have enough volume. So one of the ways Amazon solved the chicken or egg problem was to provide what we call one-sided value. So the store provided one-sided value, attracted a lot of buyers. Amazon was the only seller. And then it added other sellers, the marketplace, and it had the technology, the user base to do that. You come out to Amazon, you don't know if you're on the store or the marketplace, for example. It's all one page to you. So to get started, you have to figure out how to deliver that value. In the case of Uber, they just hired lots of drivers. In the case of Airbnb, they made a list of people with properties to rent. But Airbnb, making a list of properties to rent from newspapers and Craigslist and other things, that didn't cost Airbnb anything. But for Uber to hire drivers to drive around, that cost them money. So that's why Uber, immediately you can see, they're a platform also, but it's a costly platform because they have to subsidize one side and then the other side charge below market prices. Whereas Airbnb doesn't have to subsidize either side. So often you can look at the beginning at the structure of the business model and make a determination whether this is likely to make money or not, or likely to be very costly. And these are common sense as we look at it now, but it seemed that investors just lost their common sense. That's why we call it platform mania.
Good term there. And John Walu, thanks you for the great session, Professor. So, and then this is about, two platforms and asking about what we see in the future of it. Blockchain technology, can it be, will it be a great platform, and how will that play out? And the fintech platforms as well. How do you see the momentum moving forward on that,
Yeah, so we do write about a little bit about blockchain. Blockchain is really an enabling technology. It's not a platform in and of itself. You have to use blockchain to do something, and you have to have multiple parties to accept it. So the original application were the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular, but Ethereum is another one. And clearly those are platforms because you have holders of the coins, and then you have potential users of the coins, or merchants, buyers and sellers, or users and merchants. So they're definitely platforms, but blockchain is an enabler. So fintech is another issue. And as I said, credit cards were the first massive global platforms, and they just used analog technology in the beginning, and then computers essentially. But they definitely, almost any financial payment service is a kind of a platform, whether it's one-sided service or bringing multiple parties together and enabling payments between buyers and sellers. Would distinguish whether it's really, I would classify that as a service or a platform. The credit card companies are platforms. They're bringing together buyers and merchants, and then the platform in itself is really the credit card and the partnerships with banks, for example. Whereas American Express was launched a little bit more like a one-sided service owned by American Express, although now they have some partnerships. So again, whether you're trying to build your business around network effects or just controlling your product or your service and then selling it from one side distinguishes whether you're a platform or not. Payment services fall into both categories.
Great. Thanks for that answer. And just for everybody else, I think there's a lot of questions about sharing the presentation. It shall be available on YouTube within 24 hours on the Ajua channel on YouTube. So just check for that. The next question is regarding the platform business models, right? Do they have control points, and how can they be identified and created? And what's relevant to network effects and governance rules?
So I missed that. We're talking about coins?
We talk about control points of platform business models. Do they have control points, right? And how can they be identified and created? This from Sabrina. And are they related to network effects and governance rules?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think in terms of control points, but I suppose you can. But whenever you look at a platform, you need to figure out which is I call it the trigger side. Which side is most important to attract one or more other sides? And that side that is that trigger needs to be free or have access to be extremely cheap. And so you need to watch that. And then you need to figure out which side will pay to reach another side. And the side that will pay, the willingness to pay, is the side that you charge. And then you have to figure out how much to charge. And again, so these are, you can think of these as control points. And so one of the problems with Uber, for example, is they need drivers to attract riders. And of course, they don't really need riders to attract drivers because they're attracting drivers just by making payments. And that's how they got started. And so the control point for them would be to be careful about how much they're paying drivers without riders, and to try to shift to letting network effects take over growth, the growth driver. So in other words, they should be operating just in markets where there's a demand-supply imbalance of drivers and riders. So where there's not good mass transit, where there's not enough taxi cabs. In those markets, Uber makes money, like New York City or London. But they don't make money in markets where there's not enough demand and they have to just pay drivers. So their goal of becoming the Amazon of transportation, of being everywhere, is a very bad idea. That's how they lose money. They just don't make money in every market. So they really need to get smaller. Certain specific segments are right now popular, like delivering food. Delivering food is more profitable than delivering people. There's just less alternatives, and you can charge both sides rather than subsidize both sides. People who receive the food will pay, and the restaurants will actually pay to have food delivered or groceries delivered. So even in the ride sharing, there are some segments that are better than others. So if you have control points, I think it really comes down to analyzing carefully the segments, the pull between the sides, which are operating by subsidies, which are being pulled by network effects, and kind of apply that fine-tooth comb analysis to your business. And then you have a chance, I think, of building a sustainable platform business.
Great. Last question from Sabrina again. If you want to compete as a product or a service-based business with a platform, what are the ideal aspects to take into account, especially as complementers? Taking into account that the company could get aggregated by any given platform and you risk losing direct contact with the consumer. I guess at the end of the day, once you start playing, platform, then you want to be able to be on both sides. I guess, where you started from, choose your side, I guess. But again, just that ask into what to take into consideration when you're trying to do that.
So again, I'm not exactly sure of the question, but there's definitely a danger that the big platforms will just buy up smaller platforms, or even buy up complementers, and that's been a major way that Amazon has grown, for example. So, for example, it can be quite dangerous if you decide, and I know there's some of these platforms in Africa and India as well, if you try to launch a business, selling your shoes or clothing online, and you use Amazon as your platform to sell that product. Now, there's thousands of entrepreneurs that have built businesses that way, and Amazon would view them as a complementer. So they're coming in on the seller side, and they're bringing together buyers. So populating the the seller side is a kind of, we would think of it as supply side, but they're complementers. But if Amazon sees that as a good business and they have your transaction data, they will buy you or buy a comparable company or launch their own product or service there. So that's kind of a dangerous thing to do, dancing with an elephant. But a way to do that is to keep coming up with products that would be more difficult for the platform to source. Maybe if you become valuable enough, they will buy you, and that is a good outcome for many entrepreneurs. Anyway, there's a lot of things that entrepreneurs need to look out for, or complementers need to look out for, when they become too reliant on some of these mega platforms. And that's one of the problems with them. Some of them are just becoming too big and too powerful, and they have too much say over how the economy functions, or even how information is distributed. And I know Facebook has run into that problem. Now, from an entrepreneur investor side, you think of that as a good problem to have if you end up winning most of the market. But from user perspective or government regulation perspective, it's not necessarily good. It could be quite harmful in the long run. So we also argue in our book that platform entrepreneurs and managers need to think of the governance issues, because they should be in the business for the long term. And if, you know, Amazon destroys markets, you know, if it destroys all the local grocery shops and retailers, you know, the government's going to put Amazon out of business, or governments will in different countries. So that's not a long-term sustainable business strategy for a platform. So they have to balance their power. That's why we talk about power in the book. They have to balance their power to what is really good for the consumer and society long-term. And any business needs to do that. But platforms that become very powerful very quickly often do not have the governance mechanisms in place. To some extent, that has been Facebook's problem. To some extent, it was Amazon's problem. But Amazon is, I think, maybe a little bit ahead of Facebook in dealing with it, and it's a little bit clearer sometimes. But there's counterfeit products and dangerous products on Amazon, just like there's dangerous information being circulated on Facebook. So it's the fourth step. If you get to be big enough, we have some advice for you. But most platforms never get that far.
Yeah, you say fourth step. I think is the fifth one on those steps you showed us earlier. In Africa, Michael, we do have a saying about dancing with elephants, and it doesn't end well, right? So again, just on that, when folks get big, it's a whole different ballgame. So we want to close it there, but not without listening to your closing remarks, please. So maybe just give us a word or two to close this off, Michael. Thank you.
Well, most of what I've tried to communicate is that platform businesses and platform entrepreneurship is different from a conventional business strategy and operation. But some things are the same. You have to have a good product to have a successful business. You have to have a good service to have a successful platform, or an innovation platform or transaction platform. So a lot of the fundamental principles of business have not really changed in the platform economy. But that being said, digital technology lets us do things that were not possible before we had this technology of the internet or smartphones. And so figuring out ways to use this technology has unleashed tremendous creativity. So even though there are some negative aspects, we're pretty bullish on the platform economy and platform entrepreneurship going forward. We just want to, you know, exercise a little bit of caution. You don't want to destroy the world and have a successful company. So the whole world will be organized in technology platforms going forward. So we all need to figure out how to manage these new types of businesses effectively.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been great listening to you. And the topic of business platforms is not an easy one. It's something you want explained to you by an expert as yourself. So we really, really do appreciate having you to explain this out, but also the fact that out of this Black Swan event of COVID-19, a pandemic, we're looking at, can Africa also come out with some business platforms to take to the world as well, right?
Well,
so that's really key.
Yeah, let me just add one thing that we now see in the medical community an attempt to use platform thinking so that we don't have to reinvent solutions like vaccines or diagnostic tests. And Bill Gates talked about that, and I'm doing some new research on that. And even in the book, we write about CRISPR gene editing as a new kind of platform technology, an enabling technology like blockchain to do many new things, enabling reuse of building blocks and components. So we're going to see more platform thinking in the medical community and also in healthcare. So it's just the beginning of platformization, let's say, of that whole sector.
Exactly. It's probably pretty much from a conservative perspective been left behind a little bit when it came to the digitization side of it, at the side of the customers. So looking forward to how that gets disaggregated across the world and how Africa especially can start to take some kind of a role in terms of coming up with some unique innovations for emerging markets as well. So thank you very much, Michael. And to the rest of the attendees as well, we couldn't have done this without all of you having attended, some of you, and some of you having asked some of the questions, which are really, really great questions, made it much more interactive. We really do appreciate you and appreciate that. Again, I want to remind you that the whole session is available on YouTube within 24 hours. So you just check on YouTube/Ajua. You should be able to see the Ajua webinars there and get this as well, so that you can go over some of the slides that maybe went a little bit too fast, and we'll be able to share this. So again, thank you all to organizers as well. We do appreciate everybody. And Michael, finally, thank you so much. Looking forward to having you next time again. And God bless, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, bye.